Hey guys! Today, I would like to discuss with you Chapter 2 of the Capital Adequacy Requirements 2023 for Canadian banks, which was released in 2019. In this presentation, I will provide an overview of the key concepts related to capital adequacy requirements, including the definitions of capital, risk-weighted assets, and the Common Equity Tier 1, CET1, Tier 1, and total capital ratios. I will also discuss the minimum capital requirements for each of these ratios and the importance of maintaining capital buffers. Let's get started. Introduction. The Capital Adequacy Requirements 2023 is a set of regulatory standards established by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, OSFI, to ensure that Canadian banks maintain sufficient levels of capital to absorb losses during periods of stress and maintain financial stability. Explanation of the purpose of Chapter 2. Chapter 2 of the document provides an overview of the key concepts related to capital adequacy requirements, including definitions of capital, risk-weighted assets, and the Common Equity Tier 1, CET1, Tier 1, and total capital ratios. It also outlines the minimum capital requirements for each of these ratios and discusses the importance of maintaining capital buffers. Key concepts. Definition of capital. In the context of the Capital Adequacy Requirements 2023, capital refers to the funds that a bank has available to absorb losses. This can include both equity and debt instruments. Risk-weighted assets, RWA. Risk-weighted assets are a measure of a bank's assets weighted by the level of risk associated with each asset. The higher the risk associated with an asset, the higher the weight assigned to it. Common Equity Tier 1, CET1, capital ratio. The CET1 capital ratio is a measure of a bank's capital strength that includes only the highest quality capital, such as common equity. It is calculated by dividing CET1 capital by risk-weighted assets. Tier 1 capital ratio. The Tier 1 capital ratio is a measure of a bank's capital strength that includes CET1 capital plus other forms of Tier 1 capital, such as preferred shares. It is calculated by dividing Tier 1 capital by risk-weighted assets. Total capital ratio. The total capital ratio is a measure of a bank's overall capital strength that includes Tier 1 capital plus Tier 2 capital, such as subordinated debt. It is calculated by dividing total capital by risk-weighted assets. Minimum capital requirements. CET1 capital ratio. Definition and calculation of the CET1 capital ratio. As mentioned earlier, the CET1 capital ratio is calculated by dividing CET1 capital by risk-weighted assets. CET1 capital includes the highest quality capital, such as common equity. Minimum CET1 capital ratio requirement. The minimum CET1 capital ratio requirement is currently 4.5%, meaning that banks must maintain a CET1 capital ratio of at least 4.5% of risk-weighted assets. Implications of falling below the minimum CET1 capital ratio. If a bank falls below the minimum CET1 capital ratio, it may be subject to restrictions on its ability to pay dividends or buy back shares, and it may be required to take remedial action to improve its capital position. Tier 1 capital ratio. Definition and calculation of the Tier 1 capital ratio. As mentioned earlier, the Tier 1 capital ratio is calculated by dividing Tier 1 capital by risk-weighted assets. Tier 1 capital includes CET1 capital plus other forms of Tier 1 capital, such as preferred shares. Minimum Tier 1 capital ratio requirement. The minimum Tier 1 capital ratio requirement is currently 6%, meaning that banks must maintain a Tier 1 capital ratio of at least 6% of risk-weighted assets. Implications of falling below the minimum Tier 1 capital ratio. If a bank falls below the minimum Tier 1 capital ratio, it may be subject to restrictions on its ability to pay dividends or buy back shares, and it may be subject to restrictions on its ability to pay dividends or buy back shares. The bank may also face additional regulatory scrutiny and be required to take remedial action to improve its capital position. In extreme cases, if a bank's capital position is deemed to be inadequate, it may be placed under supervision by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, OSFI. Under such supervision, the bank would be required to develop a plan to improve its capital position, and it may be subject to additional restrictions on its business activities. In severe cases, OSFI may also require the bank to raise additional capital or even take over the bank's operations in order to protect depositors and maintain financial stability. Therefore, it is essential for banks to maintain capital levels above the minimum regulatory requirements to avoid such potential consequences. Total capital ratio. The total capital ratio is a measure of a bank's overall capital position and is calculated as the sum of Tier 1 capital and Tier 2 capital divided by the bank's risk-weighted assets. The minimum total capital ratio requirement for Canadian banks is 10.5%, which includes a minimum Tier 1 capital ratio of 7%. Implications of falling below the minimum total capital ratio. If a bank falls below the minimum total capital ratio requirement, it may face similar consequences as falling below the minimum Tier 1 capital ratio, including restrictions on dividends and share buybacks, additional regulatory scrutiny, and potential placement under supervision by OSFI. Capital buffers. Capital buffers are additional layers of capital that banks are required to hold on top of the minimum regulatory capital requirements. There are two types of capital buffers, the capital conservation buffer and the countercyclical capital buffer. Capital conservation buffer. The capital conservation buffer is designed to ensure that banks have an additional cushion of capital during periods of stress. It is calculated as a percentage of a bank's risk-weighted assets and is phased in gradually from 2016 to 2019. The minimum capital conservation buffer requirement for Canadian banks is 2.5%. Implications of falling below the capital conservation buffer. If a bank falls below the capital conservation buffer requirement, it may face restrictions on discretionary distributions, such as dividends and share buybacks, until the buffer is restored. Countercyclical capital buffer. The countercyclical capital buffer is designed to increase during periods of excessive credit growth and decrease during economic downturns to ensure that banks have sufficient capital to absorb losses during a crisis. The buffer is currently set at 0% in Canada. Implications of falling below the countercyclical capital buffer. If the countercyclical capital buffer is raised above 0% in the future and a bank falls below the requirement, it may face restrictions on discretionary distributions until the buffer is restored. Conclusion. Recap of key concepts and requirements. In summary, the Capital Adequacy Requirements 2023 for Canadian banks include minimum regulatory capital requirements, such as the Tier 1 capital ratio and total capital ratio, as well as capital buffers, such as the Capital Conservation Buffer and Countercyclical Capital Buffer. Importance of meeting minimum capital requirements and maintaining capital buffers. It is essential for banks to meet the minimum capital requirements and maintain sufficient capital buffers to ensure their ability to absorb losses during periods of stress and maintain financial stability. Implications of non-compliance with the Capital Adequacy Requirements 2023. If banks fail to comply with the Capital Adequacy Requirements 2023, they may face restrictions on business activities, additional regulatory scrutiny, and potential placement under supervision by OSFI, which could ultimately threaten the safety and soundness of the Canadian financial system.